So let's go ahead and get into it today. Here's our agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about being a healthcare proxy. What does that mean? We're going to talk about thinking about what matters and developing a plan for care. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time on how to talk about death and dying. This is a very taboo subject in a lot of cultures, but especially in American culture. We kind of have this idea that, if we don't talk about it, it's not going to happen. But we all know that we are all in the same boat when it comes to um, our lives being finite. And so we definitely want to talk about how do we talk about that with our loved ones. And then how are we going to go about it if our loved one is cognitively impaired? Okay. So this may be a sensitive topic for a lot of you, but I do hope that you find the information useful. And again, if you don't want to sit through the whole thing, if it gets a little bit too much for you, that's perfectly okay. You can come back and watch the recording later on. Okay. All right. So being a healthcare proxy. So a healthcare proxy basically gives you the ability to communicate with your loved ones, doctors, nurses, their care team, as well as have access to their medical records. And this can help you make informed decisions about the person that you're caring for, right? You are their representative in that space. So oftentimes, agencies, doctors' offices, they have a lot of protocols around the kind of information they can share. There's a lot of privacy laws in place for good reason. And so they don't just give information out willy-nilly to everyone who asks for it. So when you are a healthcare proxy, what that means is that your loved one had determined at some point that you were the one that was going to be able to make those decisions for them in the event that they cannot make them for themselves. Okay. So it's basically signaling to the care team, this is a trusted individual that can make choices for the patient. And so they will be more likely to share that private information with you. Okay. So by discussing your loved one's preferences regarding their healthcare now, you can prepare to make decisions about the testing that they may want to take or not want to take, right? Different procedures and treatments, okay? There's a lot of people who have a very specific idea of how they want the end of their life to play out, and they have made those instructions very clear. But unfortunately, there are some people who have not even thought about it, right? And so it can be very difficult for you to try to navigate that system when you're not really sure what your loved one wants. And we'll talk about that later on. But it's important to understand that while your decisions may have financial implications as a healthcare proxy, you are only responsible for making healthcare decisions. Okay. So you don't have to handle those financial matters. And that's some of you are healthcare proxies and you're also power of attorney. And so you also have to have those financial decisions to be, being made by you. But this is specifically just for healthcare. Okay. And so there's a legal document that will authorize you as a proxy to speak on someone's behalf. And that's kind of known as, you're the healthcare proxy, or it's called an advance directive. Okay, so like I said before, sometimes people have these plans in place, and that's what it's called. It's called a healthcare directive. Or an advance directive, excuse me. And so that's going to include both the healthcare proxy form, a living will, which outlines specific medical treatments that the person would or would not want. Some people want to be put on life support. Some people don't. Okay. Some people have, do not resuscitate orders. Some people have, no feeding tubes, things like that. And some people want anything and everything that they can offer. And so it's really important to have that information as best as you can. So that way, when this situation hits, you are better prepared, better equipped to make those choices. Okay. So there's some things you can consider. First and foremost, which I think is so much more or so important, is there's no such thing as a perfect proxy. Okay. So it might seem overwhelming. You're afraid you're going to make the wrong decisions. You're afraid maybe you're not going to understand everything, and that's completely normal. Okay. Most of us are not trained in all of the things that are required at the end of life, right? We're not legal professionals, we're not medical professionals. And then we also consider, there's emotion and relationship tied into these decisions. And so it can be very disorienting. So we can definitely be very hard on ourselves in these spaces. So just remind yourself, there's no such thing as a perfect proxy, just like there's no such thing as a perfect caregiver or a perfect child or a perfect spouse, right? So as a proxy, you will only need to try your best, right? Nobody expects you to be perfect. A proxy bases decisions on what they know matters to the person that they're representing, right? Some of you have been caregiving for your loved one for years and years and years, and their family and friends that you've known, most of your life. You know them, you know what they want, you know what they don't want, at least to some degree, right? You may not know exactly, but you can say things, mom would never want this, right? And so in any situation, your goal will be to give a voice to what you know about that person's values. Okay. Especially if there's, spiritual or religious components to it too, right? Some people have very strong beliefs around death and dying that need to be addressed during that process, right? And so you're going to need to speak for the person as if, or if they're unable to speak for themselves. Okay. So that means putting aside your own priorities, your own preferences, and what you think about the situation, right? And speak for the person and what they would want for the situation, which can be incredibly difficult, right? Especially if your loved one maybe has one of those, no life support orders, and you are really struggling with that, right? But again, the proxy is there to serve as the mouthpiece or the voice for the person who no longer has it. Okay. So you will also need to be able to answer the question, if they could speak and make their own decisions, what would they say and what would they decide? Okay. Also, as a proxy, you'll have certain legal responsibilities. Okay. So you will have to take the legal power to make medical decisions for that person if they can't make them for themselves. Okay. So in order to do that, you'll have to have full access to their personal medical information, right? And so there's that privacy law that we kind of hear about in doctor's office called HIPAA, HIPAA, and that's just a medical Privacy Act, okay? And so you will legally be able to access that information as the proxy. You'll be able to talk to the person's doctors, gather information on their condition so you can make informed decisions about, again, tests and procedures and other treatments for that person. So if you're not really fully aware of their medical history or their diagnosis, you're not going to be able to make those decisions on their behalf. So it's a responsibility of yours then to be aware and to be knowledgeable of the treatments that they are being offered, or even the ones that they would want or that they would refuse. Okay. And serving as a proxy does not make you responsible, again, to pay for the person's care. It's just you're the voice that they no longer have. And preferences aren't always possible, unfortunately, right? Sometimes it's not possible physically, medically, or financially to follow every one of somebody's healthcare preferences, and that's okay. Okay. You're not dishonoring your loved one because you can't afford certain things that they wanted. Okay. Or if it's not available, or if the medical professionals are just saying that's not possible. Okay. So, a healthcare proxy definitely has a lot of power, a lot of control, but there are just some things that are not possible, and that's okay. Okay. We don't want to beat ourselves up for that. So, for example, someone might prefer to spend their last days at home, but their condition makes that impossible for whatever reason. Typically, they try to adhere to the wishes as cleanly and as clearly as they possibly can. But there are some things that just aren't possible. Okay. And that's something that you would have the right to have that conversation with the medical professionals. So you would just do your best to make the decision on the information you have and try to find other ways to meet that person's preference based on what matters most to them. Okay. So thinking about what matters. Here's some helpful ways to think about what matters to your loved one and help you kind of prepare for this role. Okay. So you can ask them, right? Some of you have loved ones that you can have these conversations with already, right? And so it's never too early to start having these conversations, especially if you're caring for someone who has a progressive disease, right? Like a dementia diagnosis or something like that, where their cognitive capacity declines. Having those conversations sooner rather than later are going to help both of you feel more comfortable when the time comes, okay? Excuse me. Excuse me. Choked on my own spit there. Okay, so ask your loved one, what does a good day look like for you, right? Is it time with family and friends? Is it favorite activities during the day, right? What do you need to enjoy a good life through the end of your life? And that may be a hard conversation to have, but it can be a very necessary conversation, and it can be one that brings you closer, right? And it can be one that makes you feel more confident when it's time to make those decisions, because then it's not about what do I do? What do I do? Is this right? Is this wrong? And all that panic and that shame and that guilt. Now it's this is what we had talked about before. This is what dad said he wanted, right? So then the guilt and the responsibility, even though it's your responsibility to enact that wish, the decision to make the choice is no longer on your shoulders, okay? So it can make things a lot easier for you. And it can also make things a lot easier for your loved one, because then they see, hey, I'm alleviating some stress off of my person who I love very dearly. But then they also know, hey, I can rest knowing that my wishes are going to be respected as well as they can be respected, right? So it can relieve a lot of uncertainty for both of you. You can ask them who or what supports you during difficult times, right? Family, friends, your culture, your pets, your faith, right? What are some things that you want to know that you can maybe bring into their space to bring them comfort if they're having a hard time? Okay. And then another question you can ask them, try finishing this sentence. What matters to me through the end of my life is, and this helps helps you to recognize or sorry, the answer could be being able to recognize my children, being independent, being able to spend time with the ones I love. Okay. And so these things may not be possible depending on the diagnosis, but to know, kind of get that essence of your loved one and what matters to them, what's important to them, can be very helpful for you moving forward, because then you know, as long as I really put a lot of emphasis on the things that matter to my loved one, all the other stuff can be whatever it is, right? Plan for care. So again, these are questions that you can ask your loved one and have that conversation about the end of life wishes that they have. Okay. And sometimes they might not even thought about it, right? Even after they get a diagnosis, even after they've been, sick or, working through this for a long time, thinking about your own mortality is a hard topic, right? It's hard enough to think about losing the ones that we love, but thinking about ourselves in that space can be very disorienting. And so they may need to be prompted. And so asking these questions can be difficult, but they can also be very precious to have these conversations, okay? So you can ask them, as a patient, what would you like to know, right? Maybe they only want to know the basics about their condition and the treatment, right? Maybe they want to know all the details, right? Some people are more avoidant than others, and they're like, I know this is going to end my life, and I don't need to know all the gory details. I can just, accept that and move on. But some people really want to know all the details. They want to know the progression. They want to know the treatments, right? And so ask them, what, as your proxy, what do you want me to inform you on, right? When there's a medical decision to be made, I would like to, right? So maybe they want their healthcare team to do what they think is best, right? I just trust the professionals. And some people may want to have a say in every healthcare decision, right? And so as your proxy, as long as they're able, you can ask them, right? And then you can ask, what are your concerns about medical treatments, right? Maybe they worry they're not going to get enough care. Maybe they worry they're going to get too much care, right? Maybe they don't want everybody fussing all over them and they don't want, IVs and all that stuff and they just kind of want to be left alone, right? But you won't know that unless you ask. So these are the questions that you can kind of ask to plan for the care that your loved one is going to receive while you're the proxy for them, okay? If I'm diagnosed with a serious illness that could shorten my life, I would prefer to let them fill in the blank, right? Maybe they don't want to know how quickly things are progressing, right? Maybe they don't want to know the doctor's prognosis of how long that they have to live, right? Um, Maybe they do want to understand all of that stuff and they want to know the doctor's estimate, right? So ask them, because if they don't want to know it and you tell them and it causes them a lot of stress and a lot of grief, um, we want to try to avoid that, right? And then on the other hand, if they want to know everything and you're keeping them in the dark, that could cause friction too, right? So again, these questions can be difficult to ask, but the answers hold a lot of value for both of you involved, okay? You can ask, if you were seriously ill or near the end of your life, how much medical treatment would you feel is right for you, right? Some people want every treatment available. Some people don't, and you wouldn't know that. And I think knowing this ahead of time is going to be is going to hold a lot of value for you towards the end when they can't speak for themselves. And you can say, well, we already had this conversation and they want you to do everything possible, right? And that also kind of helps you keep your own emotions and your own feelings out of the way as much as possible, because you're still going to have them, right? And you're still going to, agree or disagree with your loved one's decisions, but you at least know what their decision is. And so you can make that decision for them and then process what you need to process on the other side, right? And you can ask them, where do you prefer to be towards the end of your life, right? Some people really want to spend their last days in the hospital and some people don't, right? Some people want to be home. So you have to have those questions answered as soon as you can, before they can't have that conversation with you. And then you're guessing, right? Which is okay, because sometimes, this conversation cannot be had and you do have to kind of just guess, and that's okay too. But if you can avoid the guesswork, it's going to be a lot easier for everybody going forward. This is my last slide on the plans for care, just questions that you can ask. If you weren't able to speak for yourself, would you want people to follow all of your wishes or do what they think is best in the moment, right? And sometimes even just asking that question gives you permission to make those decisions, knowing that they trust you, right? And so you can say, well, we didn't have all of these questions answered. I'm just going to have to make my best judgment, and know that your loved one trusts you to make that judgment, okay? So you don't feel so guilty for those choices that you have to make. And they may say, I want the people I trust to do exactly what I've said, even if it makes them uncomfortable, right? Or I want the people I trust to do what brings them peace, even if it's different than what I've said, right? Some people cannot bear the thought of their loved one agonizing over a treatment that they've chosen. And so they're like, well, at that point, you might as well just do what makes you feel better, because I'm not going to be worried about it, right? So these are little permissions that they can give you while they're still able. Ask them about how they want you to share their information about their health with others, right? Some people don't want anyone to know what's going on with them. They don't want all their loved ones to know the details, right? And so they don't want you to talk about it to everybody else. You can give generic updates, but they don't want the details shared. And some people are very comfortable with all of that information being shared, right? But we don't think about that in the moment, right? And so again, these are how we can plan for that. Ask them these questions, get them thinking about it. And then you can just ask, when I die, I want to be alone or I want to be with loved ones, right? I want to be with other people. And I'll be honest with you, as somebody who is, in a stage of life where I'm still functioning and I'm still, have all my capacities, I don't have a diagnosis, I've never thought about these questions. And so it's probably true to some degree that most of us haven't, right? Even after a diagnosis, some of us might not have thought, well, I didn't think about how I would want my information shared with others, but that's definitely something that you're going to have to consider on their behalf. And so it's good to ask those questions when you can. All right, just a few more slides, and then we'll be done for today. It always seems too soon until it's too late, okay? So here are some other questions that you can consider. And I think I have this in a PDF form somewhere. So if you want that information, I can email that to you. Because I know it's a lot. I don't want you to feel like you have to take notes or anything. So when you sit with your loved one, if they've designated you as their proxy, the end of life advocate for them, and you're not really sure how to get the plan going, these are some other questions that you might want to cover when you have that conversation with them, right? Ask them if they have any worries about their health. Some people are very accepting from the very beginning. Some people shift, the pendulum swings a lot. So we can ask these questions because we want to make sure that if they do have worries, we can do what we can to kind of calm those worries for them, right? What do you need addressed so that you can feel more prepared, right? Finances, property, legal documents, relationships, right? Other healthcare situations. What do they feel they need more preparation on? Okay. And I'll tell you right now, getting all the documents and all the financial things and all that stuff in order, getting that together before the end is so valuable to the caregiver and to the proxy because it's so difficult to be in a space where you're grieving and have to switch into this almost like administration mode, and you're digging through piles of papers and you're going through storage units to try to find financial documents and things like that from 1984, right? That's incredibly stressful, especially if you're grieving. So if you can kind of get some of that out of the way now, it's going to be easier for you in the end. Not that the end will be easy, but it will be easier because there'll be less things you have to think about. Okay. Ask them, do you have any fears or concerns or mistrust about where or how you receive healthcare? Okay. There are some people who have been burned by the system one too many times and they don't trust doctors and they don't trust lawyers and they don't trust social workers. Okay. So if you try to bring those people into their space, they're not okay with that. Okay. So you can kind of address that while they're still aware and have those conversations. Okay. Who do you want or not want to be involved in healthcare, right? We all have that one family member who is, always trying to bit their hands and stuff, and they just make it worse, right? So maybe they don't want, Auntie Gina coming over and messing everything up. Figure that out, right? Maybe they do want Auntie Gina coming in and dictating what happens because she's very, aggressive and organized, right? Have those conversations. And if you are an Auntie Gina listening to this, I'm not no shade to you. That's just a name that randomly popped in my head. When you look ahead to the future, are there important events or dates that you hope you're there for? And this one can be hard, right? Because there might not be a guarantee that they can be there for that. But if they show you that it's important to them, then you know that you can try to prioritize that if possible, right? Are there kinds of treatment you would want or not want? We kind of talked about this a little bit, like resuscitation attempts, ventilations, feeding tubes. Some people are perfectly okay with that. Some people absolutely do not want that, especially if there's a religious or cultural component to it, right? So we need to be sure that we're asking these questions. And the last one I'll give you. If your health condition changed, when would it be okay with you to shift from trying to cure an illness to trying to enjoy the end of life as much as possible? Okay. Some people are going to fight to the end, right? And some people are going to accept the end and just want to make the most of what they have left. Okay, they don't want to spend the last days of their lives trying to fight something that's taking them over, right? They'd rather be at home with their loved ones. And that's okay. That's perfectly okay. So how do you talk about it, right? Because of course we're not thinking we're just going to pop over to mom's house and drill it with all these questions in one afternoon, right? That might not be the best way to go about doing it, right? But there's a lot of reasons why we find talking about death and dying difficult, right? We're maybe afraid we're going to say the wrong thing, we're going to hurt someone's feelings. So here's a few tips that might help you start the conversation, okay? Now I gave you a bunch of questions that you can ask, but this is how do you start that conversation? So I want to talk face to face if possible, right? We don't want to have a text conversation about the plans that they perceive for themselves at the end of their lives. Maybe you do. Maybe that's the kind of personality that, your loved one has, and they'd rather, avoid it without avoiding it. But for the most part, most people want to have these face-to-face conversations, right? Or at least over the phone. Choose a quiet, comfortable place where you're not likely to be interrupted, right? We want to turn off our phones so we're not disturbed. And we don't want to use euphemisms, okay? So going to sleep kind of thing, right? We want to be clear, honest, and we want to be clear and honest with our language, okay? Because it's important, especially if you're talking with someone who has dementia or someone with a learning disability or a child. We want to be very clear with what we're having the conversation about, okay? And people can, of course, have very different reactions to death depending on their attitudes and their beliefs or the relationship they have with the person who's dying. And so it's important to take the individual feelings into consideration and avoid pushing anyone to talk if they don't want to, okay? Especially if you're kind of having like a family meeting, or maybe your loved one just isn't ready to have this conversation with you, right? They'd rather not. And so the conversation can be helpful, but sometimes it's not an option, okay? And we just have to be okay with that. And of course, we want to be honest, right? In difficult situations, it's not uncommon for us to search for the right thing or the clever thing to say, right? Or we can deny what's happening altogether. And it is natural to kind of use humor, right? To kind of deflect. It has its place. But dying is a profound process that needs honesty and understanding, okay? So frank, open conversations can be liberating. They can be soothing, both for you and your loved one. Next, listen, right? Listen to the person, pay attention to their body language. What are they saying without saying? Don't be afraid to look them in the eye when you're talking to them, right? Listen to their tone of voice. Be aware of changes, right? To the way that they speak or the way that they behave, right? If they avoid eye contact, that might be they're not ready to have this conversation, right? Some people might get angry if you bring it up, right? So just be mindful of that, okay? It's a very, I don't want to say hard conversation because it doesn't always have to be hard. But the topic, again, is kind of taboo. It's not a pleasant thought, right? And then finally, stay calm, okay? You might find that this kind of emotional intimacy is very difficult, okay? Especially if you have a certain dynamic with your loved one where communication has been difficult, where vulnerability has been difficult, or maybe where they're in, maybe some kind of denial about what's going on, right? We want to stay calm, and we might be worried about seeing our loved one cry or be vulnerable or appear helpless, right? So we can keep ourselves grounded, physically feeling your feet in the floor, right? Breathing, right? All these little grounding techniques that we can pick up along the way. That's going to help you stay present, okay? And of course, don't be afraid to cry yourself, right? Crying is a natural response to emotionally charged situations. And being brave enough to express your grief can have a powerful and healing effect on the person that you're talking to, as well as kind of giving them permission to grieve themselves, okay? It's a very strange thing to grieve your own death, right? And some people are. Some people are very aware of what's happening. And so there's some grief there that can be really hard to name, okay? And of course, you don't have to do all of the talking, right? Sometimes just being next to someone in silence can be really comforting, right? So maybe you bring up the conversation, but you don't finish it that day, right? You just kind of plant that seed and leave yourself open to the conversation when they're ready, okay? Let them know they can talk to you if they need you to talk, right? Um, give them permission to talk in their own time without expectation. All right, my last slide. If your loved one is cognitively impaired, okay? So if your loved one can still process information effectively, you can lead them through a questionnaire known as Where I Stand scales, okay? You can look this up online, but it's just kind of saying, like, on a scale of 1 to 5, for instance, ask how much they'd like to know about their condition and their treatment, how much of a say they would like to have in their medical treatment, right? Kind of like the conversation or the conversation starters I gave you earlier, right? So you can just kind of say, on a scale of 1 to 5, where are you on that? If they're in the mid stages of the disease, your loved ones are encouraged to gather information in small bites and look for the right opportunities to talk, right? People with dementia often have moments where they remember certain events clearly, like the extended illness of maybe like a friend or a family member. And those topics can offer the chance to ask questions that may uncover your loved one's medical preferences, right? So we might not be able to sit and have a long coffee talk, right, about this, but you may be able to have these little moments of time where you can say, oh, so and so is going through treatment. How would you like to experience treatment for yourself, right? You can kind of ride the coattails of somebody else's situation, right? And of course, if your loved one cannot participate in the conversation, hold a family meeting if possible, right? And maybe ask them all to fill out the questionnaire, ask the questions, and answer them as if they were that person, right? And then you can kind of get a general consensus of what does everybody feel this person would want, right? So often the doctors will have the family in the room and they'll all be absolutely positive that their loved one wanted something, and they'll all have a different idea of what that is, right? So it's critical to say, let's bring this person in the room, right? How do they make decisions? When did they say something about someone else who had Alzheimer's or dementia, right? Figure out what that person wanted, not what you want, okay? It can be really hard to separate yourself if your wants are different than that of your loved one, right? And so with someone in cognitive decline, you really do have to be a detective in a lot of ways, right? You've got to use your intuition and you've got to translate signals, right? It's already hard enough. And so you're all kind of going through this, everyone, the family involved, you're kind of plodding through it with, your own grief underlying it, right? And so looking for signals in a loved one's, if they have like suddenly foreign behavior, right? That requires separating yourself from that grief long enough to view those behaviors not as a reminder of something lost, but as a token of something valuable. Okay. So we want to pay attention. Have the conversation early if you can. If you can't have the conversation with your loved one, try to enlist others that were close, that were part of the family, part of the circle, that know your loved one, and try to come to a consensus of what you can agree on that they probably would want based on that person's personality, things that they've said in the past, how they've reacted to things in the past. So you don't have to go it alone. And if you do have to go it alone, if you don't have family members and friends that you can kind of, collectively have this conversation with, know that your loved one put you in control because they trust you. Okay. So draw strength from that. Okay. Again, Like I said in the very beginning, there's no perfect proxy, okay? We were all going to make mistakes. Even if you have a detailed list of all the things that they wanted, right? There's still going to be room for error. There's still going to be surprises. There's still going to be things that you didn't discuss. So just rest in the fact that your loved one thought well enough of you to trust you to make the decisions on their behalf, okay? And sometimes that's all you have to go on, but sometimes that's enough, right? So here's my contact info. If you need to reach out to me for additional resources, for quick care chat, if you're kind of feeling some kind of way and you need a conversation, you can call me 256-859-8300, or you can send me an email, jstang@ucphuntsville.org. Okay.